What's one piece of advice that you would have given your 16-year-old self?
I wish I was a little bit more patient, because I was so hungry to prove to the world that I was a winner, because I was such a loser in school, that I just worked every minute.
I boiled it down to 3 things: be wrong, to fail more, and to dumb it down a little.
Don't be so high and mighty that you don't take advantage of the humble opportunities that are granted to you.
Like if my high school self was sitting here, I'd be like, hey man, good news. It's gonna go well. You know, maybe I would have gone on the ski trips so I could be good at skiing now and into it.
I guess we could sum it up another way to say just worry less, do more, and trust the path that unfolds in front of you.
All right. Well, good morning. All right. Whew, tough crowd. Yeah, I know it feels like we're on the scene of The Empire Strikes Back out there, but everything will be well later today. 15 years ago, I was almost killed by a bear. 15 years ago. I was living in the mountains of Colorado at the time, and my good friend Jerry and I, we had this idea that we wanted to do a spiritual retreat. Okay, so the two of us, just two guys, getting away from it all, getting out with God alone in God's beautiful creation. And thankfully, through some connections that I had at the church that I was working at the time, we were given access to the perfect place. It was a little cabin on 100 acres of mountain range. And Dan and Debbie were 2 people that attended our church. They were both retired pilots, and they owned this property and had built this huge horse ranch on this property. And this small cabin that they gave us access to, which it was actually what they lived in while they were building their forever home. And so we were just thrilled to be, given the opportunity to stay at this cabin. We didn't take a lot, just an overnight bag, a little bit of food that we could cook on a fire, an acoustic guitar, and 2 Bibles. That's all we had. And we met Dan and Debbie at the gate of their ranch first thing in the morning, and we followed them to the cabin. And after spending some time, them just kind of showing us around, showing us the property, showing how everything worked, they said their goodbyes, and off they went. And Jerry and I spent the rest of the day just kind of alone in God's creation, just basking in it. We were enjoying ourselves, praying, did some reading and some time like that. We did some walking around and just kind of being in awe of God's wonder, God's miraculous creation. It was an amazing time. And then the sun eventually started to go down, and so we decided we're going to make a fire and roast some hot dogs, and so we got that going. And as we were doing that, off in the distance, we could hear the sound of a 4-wheeler or a 3-wheeler coming our way. And eventually we found out it was Dan. And Dan, being Dan, the type of guy that he was just coming to see if we were okay, if there was anything that we needed. We assured him that we didn't need anything, but we were gracious to have him with us, and we invited him to stick around, enjoy a hot dog or 2. And so we sat around the fire just laughing, telling stories, and hanging out. It was really good. And eventually, Dan got tired of us, bored of us, I don't know, and he decided it was time to go. And so he said, hey, I'm going to get out of here, leave you guys alone. And that was, cool. And so he started to get ready. And just as he was getting ready to leave, all 3 of us heard a sound in the bushes behind us. And all 3 of us kind of turned around kind of quickly. It was, it's one of those things where you're in a place where there shouldn't be a whole lot of noise outside of the noise that you're making. And so we heard this, and we all turned around and we looked, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything. And so we were doing that thing that you do when you're in the dark. You try extra hard to kind of focus and pay attention. And so we're kind of looking, and we can't really see anything for the darkness. And the only sound that we could hear was the crackling of the fire kind of beside us as we're kind of looking. Can't see anything. And then all of a sudden, as we focused a little bit more, you could see it. It looked like a bush, but it wasn't, because it was moving. And I started to say something, and Dan said, shh, it's a bear. And instantly, I was thankful that I brought 2 pairs of underwear. Like, it was just like, it was that moment, like, I'm not ready for this, and it's like, oh my goodness. And Jerry and I were both kind of like this, looking, and it's like, that is a bear. And I didn't know what to do. Like, and it's that moment, like, you can feel your heart beating. And I wanted to move, but I couldn't, and I didn't know what to do. And I was like, trying to remember, like, what are you supposed to do when there's a bear and all this other stuff? You have to outrun not the bear, but just the people you're with. And I was trying to do all the math as to kind of how I was going to get out of this situation. I'm looking like, oh my goodness. And then I didn't know what to do. And so eventually Dan spoke up and he said, oh, don't worry about it. It's just a little one. I'll shoo him away. And I thought to myself, that doesn't sound right. Like, I don't think you're supposed to shoo a bear away. But sure enough, he was wearing his belt buckle and his cowboy boots, and he jumped up and he said, get out of here. Jerry and I were like, nah, I'm not getting in on that action. I'm just going to kind of stay back here. And so Jerry and I were both like this, like we were a part of a wax museum, like we were just not moving. And Dan was doing this thing like he was, yeah, get out of here, go on, get out of here, kind of thing. And his cowboy boots kept hitting the rock. And I'm like, this isn't going to go well. This isn't going to. And again, I didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. And my heart was beating faster the closer and closer that Dan got to this bear. And I'm thinking, like, I kept looking at Jerry, like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Jerry was looking at me like, I don't know. And so Dan kept, gesturing towards the bear. And finally, he did it one more time. And he goes, go on. And he jumps like that. And the bear went, and the bear got up on its hind legs. And that was it. Jerry and I took off like two sprinters from the Olympics. We were gone. And we headed towards the cabin. I made it there first, mainly because I pushed Jerry out of the way. And we got to the cabin. We both bounded in through the door, slammed the door, flicked off the lights, and Jerry, with one swoop of his arm, went like this across the table, knocked everything off the table, and was like, help me get this table in front of the door. And I'm like, but what about Dan? And he's like, forget him, it's his own fault. And so we moved the table, and we started putting it in front of the thing, and then we both hunkered down and got on the floor, and it was like this, and I swear, it was so quiet, but we could hear each other's heart beating. It was so quiet. Not a sound. Not a sound. And then there was a knock at the door. And I'm thinking, bears don't normally knock, do they, before they... And so we're sitting there and we didn't say anything. And finally, both of us looked at each other and we're like, hello? And we heard, guys, it's me. We're like, oh man, it's Dan, thank goodness. So we jumped up, we moved the table back, we flicked on the light, opened the door, and there was Dan standing right next to the bear. Right next to the bear, both of them, laughing. And then the bear took off its mask, and it was Debbie. We'd been had. And I'd like to say the four of us laughed, but we did not. Two of them did. And that was the end of the story. So last week we began this series called What If, and the whole idea around this series is simply this. Stories are easier to endure when you know how they end, right? Stories are just easier to endure when you know how they end, right? When someone's telling you a story like I just told you, it's easier to follow them through the twists and the ups and the downs when you know that in the end, everything's going to work out. Everybody's going to be fine. So I'm telling you that story, and even though at first you didn't know that I was pranked that night, you definitely knew that I wasn't eaten by a bear that night because I'm standing here. But what's interesting is in that moment, I didn't know either of those things. I had no idea how things were going to play out in the midst of that circumstance because stories are easier to endure when you know how they end. But the question throughout the series is simply, what if? What if that hadn't have been a prank? And what if that had been a real bear? And what if you had got caught? And what if you had started? Or what if you had stopped? What if you had asked for forgiveness? What if she had have forgiven you? What if you hadn't have quit? What if you had asked? What if you had prayed? What if you had stepped out in faith? Or what if you hadn't have stepped out in faith? What if? And as I said last week, for those of you that weren't here, I think one of the reasons many of us don't experience the change that we want to see happen in our lives is because we don't allow the question, what if, to sober us long enough to really evaluate some things that are going on in our lives. And the minute that we start to feel it, the minute that it begins to get too close, we change gears as fast as we possibly can, and we start trying to think of something else, or we run to something else, or sometimes we run to someone else. And so last week we began looking at a famous story found in the scriptures. Better yet, we began looking at the end of a famous story found in the scriptures. A story that many of you, if not all of you, have heard of to varying degrees. Some of you have heard it so many times, you just sigh at the thought of hearing it again. It's found in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, verse 50. And I want to show you what it says. Many of you already know this. It says, so David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. And so again, many of you, regardless of your church background, you know the story of David and Goliath. You've heard it before. It's told outside the church all the time, especially in sports. You hear commentators use this illustration or this analogy all the time. It's like, this is a David and Goliath type battle, right? Who's going to win? This happens all the time. And since you already know, my guess is how this story ends, the question is, what if? What if it had ended differently? What if David had made some different decisions along the way? The answer is it wouldn't have ended the way that we know that it ended, and the story wouldn't be the story that we know. And the reason that this is so important is that every single one of us in this room with every day of our lives is writing another page in the story of your life. And even though we know Goliath goes down in the midst of David's story, David still has to live it out in the face of uncertainty. Again, as we talked about last week, David didn't have the luxury of reading 1 Samuel 17:50. He had no idea how his story was going to end. He had to live it out in the face of uncertainty. And even though you've heard 100 sermons about how David defeats Goliath, there are 3 things that David faced before he ever got in front of Goliath. And the whole point of this series is to simply ask, what if? What if any one of those 3 things had gone differently? If they had, it wouldn't have ended the way that we all know that it ended, and the story wouldn't be the story that you know. Last week we looked at how at the beginning of David's this journey in David's life, how his father Jesse gave him a simple task of taking some food down to his brothers on the battle lines. It was just a simple thing. And we asked the question, what if? What if David had been typical? What if David had tripped over the ordinary? What if David had felt slighted because he was asked to do something that he deemed insignificant? What if? Now, thankfully, we know that didn't happen, right? We know that he embraced the moment. We know that he embraced the ordinary. He embraced the ordinary, and because he did, it put him on a path that led to a defining moment that would have him seen as extraordinary. And so the big takeaway from last week was this: opportunity presents itself as ordinary. Opportunity presents itself as ordinary, and that's why the challenge to you and to me is to be mindful, is to be present, is to be faithful, it's to be obedient in the ordinary, in the day-to-day, to be faithful and mindful in the day-to-day, because opportunity presents itself as ordinary. Now, today we're going to pick up where we left off in David's story, and today I'm really, really excited that you're here because I believe there is so much in what we're about to see that's not just important for us to see, it's not just important for us to hear or understand. This is what we're going to talk about this morning, is something that I need, and my hope is that you will apply in our lives as we continue to live out our story. It says this, it says, early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. So he did the obedient in the midst of the ordinary. And it goes on. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. So there's this big face-off. And then, go on, David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. So it tells us that he ran to the battle lines. He leaves his things with the people who were tending, the keeper of the supplies. He left it there. David is a responsible young man, and he gets down to the battle lines having and this is important, he has no intention of facing a giant that we know he's about to face. He has no intention of that whatsoever. And he gets down there, and he's up to the battle lines. And what we're about to see is that David, and this is so important, David has to face an offense before ever facing Goliath. David has to face an offense before ever facing Goliath. And this is what's so important for you, and this is what's so important for me. Sometimes you and I end up fighting the wrong battle. Sometimes you and I end up fighting the wrong battle. And if we don't pay attention to what's going on, and if we're not mindful of the moment, we could find ourselves wasting effort and energy and emotion on a battle that really isn't the one that we're meant or supposed to be fighting. And this is so incredibly important. You won't see it in David's story right away, I promise you. And what I do know is that it's almost impossible to see in the day-to-day as we're living out our story. But it's important for us to get this and get this right, because if not, we could end up investing so much time and energy fighting a battle we were never intended to fight and miss the one that we were called to war against. So David gets down to the battle lines. He leaves the things with the keeper of supplies. He gets down there. He sees his brothers, and he's like, hey, guys. Those people that kind of walk in, hey, how's it going? What did I miss, right? And that's what happens. And it goes, so he kind of jumps in. As he was talking with them, meaning his brothers, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Goes on. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him with great fear. So they see this giant, they run. Now the Israelites have been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king, it says, Go on. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel. So these guys, they're sitting there and they're like, oh my goodness, this guy is so big. He's like 9'2". This guy is huge. He comes out day after day and he says the same thing over and over and over again. He's defying Israel. He's defying our God. But what are we going to do about it? There's nothing we can do about it. Look at the size of this guy. There's nothing. One preacher I heard one time said that the Israelite army looked at Goliath and said, he's too big to kill. And David looked at Goliath and said, he's too big to miss. It makes you wonder sometimes, what's your perspective? What's your perspective in the midst of whatever it is you're facing today? What's your perspective? So David gets down there and he's like, so what do I get if I kill him? And they're like, well, Saul at the beginning just said, who wants to fight him? But now we've been out here for like 40 days. So Saul keeps upping the ante, kind of like the way the airlines do when their flights are overbooked. Someone comes over the PA, we're looking for 2 volunteers from the kindness of their heart. Nobody comes forward, right? Then they come on a little bit later, we're looking for 2 volunteers from the kindness of your heart, and we'll give you $200. Nobody comes. A little while later, we're looking for 2 volunteers, and we're willing to offer you $500. Nobody comes forward. We're looking for 2 volunteers from the kindness of your heart. We're willing to give you $1,000, 2 flights, and a stay in a luxurious hotel. Blackouts may apply, right? So they try to get, right? The more desperate they become, the more the reward becomes, right? And Saul has gotten to the point where he is so desperate. He's like, listen, I'm willing to give you my daughter in marriage, the hot one, and your family won't have to pay taxes. And David's like, what? Can I get this in writing? Right? Like he's like, I need to make sure this is real because it doesn't make sense to him. And see, here's the point that we so easily miss. And again, when you know the end of the story, you sometimes miss the things that are so important about the story. And you have to remember, David hasn't been there for 40 days like the rest of these soldiers. So he's not as used to the dysfunction as they are. He hasn't gotten used to standing there in defeat. He hasn't got used to standing there feeling deflated. Like he shows up on the scene after 40 days and they've heard Goliath talk so much and so often and they've heard what he said over and over and over again that to them it's just normal. But David walks in completely with a different perspective and he's like, wait a minute, this doesn't sound right. He's not supposed to talk like that. And sometimes, and many of you have experienced this, many of you find yourself in the midst of this where you're so used to being in this dysfunctional environment that you find yourself in. And you begin to make excuses for the environments you settle in. And it's easy to make excuses for the environments you settle for. But David shows up and he's like, what? He said, what? About what? And I get what if I kill him? Right? Now this is the point, and I need you to kind of buckle your seatbelts and hang with me for just a little bit because this is the part where it applies directly to you and it applies directly to me. Anytime that God is wanting to do something in your life, anytime you have a sense and a stirring in your heart that I think that God wants to do something new, God wants to do something fresh in my life, anytime that happens, you will come against opposition in your life every single time. And here's the thing, and for those of you that are new to church, those of you who used to go to church and you walk away, some of you aren't sure what you believe, and the whole spiritual God, Jesus, Bible, faith thing, it's a little bit mystical and you're not sure, but you're still here. That's wonderful. We believe, and the scriptures teach that we have a war, and we war against something that is not flesh and blood, the scriptures teach us. That the battle that we wage against is one of a spiritual nature. There is a spiritual realm. There is a spiritual war, spiritual dynamic taking place. And we have an adversary whose name is Satan. He is our enemy, ultimate enemy. And he comes against us, and there is this war waging that cannot be seen, though we see the effects of it in our world. And we have been called to wage against this enemy. And when God is wanting to do something in your life, and when you take that step to try to step out in faith and do something in the name of the Lord that God is prompting you, God is calling you to do, you will come against this enemy. And what the enemy will do every single time is try to bring an enemy into your life that isn't the real enemy to distract you from fighting the one you've been called to fight. Every time. There will come this enemy into your life that will seem to be a distraction. It will seem to be your enemy. It will seem that this is the thing I'm fighting against, when in reality it's sent to be a distraction to keep you from fighting against the very thing you've been called to defeat in your life. And in David's case, and this is important, you need to, again, hang with me here. In David's case, it was his oldest brother, Eliab. Eliab. Now, Eliab was tall. I don't know exactly how tall he was, but he was tall. So tall, in fact, that if you read one chapter earlier in this book, if you read 1 Samuel chapter 16, you will see that the prophet Samuel actually thought for just a moment that Eliab would be the next king. And the reason that he thought Eliab would be the next king is because Eliab was tall. And Saul, the current king, was tall. And when Samuel looked at Eliab, he saw in Eliab what he saw in Saul. And he jumped to the conclusion that Eliab must be the next king because he saw height, not heart. And God in 1 Samuel 16 says, look, I don't want you to focus on height. I want you to focus on heart. You have to stop judging things externally. You have to stop judging things externally. It's what's inside that counts. And if you read through 1 Samuel 16, and this is so important, I would really encourage you to do, you're not going to do anything else today. It's going to be snowing. Just sit back, grab your Bible, grab some coffee, read 1 Samuel 16 and 17 again in light of what we're talking about. Because what happens is so profound and powerful. So you got to imagine this. Eliab is paraded out there like with all of Jesse's other sons, okay, kind of like a Miss America pageant. They're all kind of brought out and they're standing, they weren't wearing pink sashes or whatever, but you get the idea. They're all paraded out there in front of Samuel as Samuel is going to determine and anoint the next king. And so Eliab is there and he stands taller than all of the other brothers. And Eliab is looked at by Samuel. And again, Samuel thinks for a second, but then God speaks to him and says, nope, he's not the guy. And he goes through all the brothers. And then he ends on David, the youngest. And God stirs in Samuel and says, this is my next king. And Samuel anoints David as the next king. And Eliab watches this take place. And you just have to wonder, what did that do to and in Eliab? To be passed by Samuel, ultimately God, and then his youngest brother, puny David, chosen to be the next king. What did that do to Eliab? You're about to see. It says, when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him. And he asks, why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep? Now, all of these things David had taken care of. We saw he's a very responsible young man. And what Eliab says to David next, and this is where I'm hoping for you, given what you're going through in your current situation. This is probably for you the thing that you're going to relate to David so much, sadly. Many of you have experienced what David is about to experience. He says this, I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle. And this is the part that's so difficult to navigate in our lives. This is the thing that is so painful. This is the point that is so hurtful. When you have people in your life who are supposed to be your advocates and your allies, and instead they become your adversaries and your accusers. Those people who are supposed to be in your corner, those people that should have your back, those people who should believe in you, instead, in whatever it is you're going through, as you're trying to step out and accomplish something in your life, they're the very ones who are condemning you and criticizing you and calling you out and questioning you and belittling you. And you're thinking the temptation in that moment is to what? To defend yourself. To stand up for yourself, to puff out your chest and to stand up and not take it on the chin and come back and to defend yourself and to argue. As my mom used to say, get in the mud and sling mud with the pigs. That's what you want to do in those moments. Your character, your heart, everything that you are is being questioned and it hurts, right? And here's David in this moment. And his oldest brother criticizes and questions and condemns him in this way. It's got to imagine how hurtful this is. And the temptation in this moment for David to kind of throw back and get into an argument with his brother. It's hurtful. It's painful. And what if? What if in this moment David stands there and goes toe-to-toe with his brother? What if? What if in this moment David puffs out his chest and begins to argue back and forth? I mean, he has every right to, right? His character, his heart is called into question. What would you do? Right? What would you do? What are you doing? As those who are supposed to be in your corner are actually the ones that are throwing the worst criticisms towards you. What do you do? What if? See, if David engages in this argument, if David stands up and defends himself, he will never stand in front of his true enemy. And here's the thing, if you're married, I want you just to don't look to your spouse. Just look right ahead if you're married, okay? Just everybody, get this. Sometimes you're fighting against what you're supposed to be fighting for, right? Sometimes you're fighting against the very thing that you're supposed to be fighting for. And sometimes we just have to call a timeout. And sometimes we just have to press pause. Sometimes we just have to step back and say, you know what? You're not my enemy. You're not the one I'm supposed to be fighting with. You're who I'm supposed to be fighting for, right? And see, if David engages in this argument, if David gets into this mode where he's trying to defend himself, he will never stand in front of his true enemy. And if he gets distracted, isn't it true sometimes we're defeated simply because we get distracted? As you look at your marriage, as you look at your career, isn't it true sometimes you get defeated just simply because you get distracted from what's really the most important thing or who the most important people are in your life? And see, you know how the story ends for David, but what if? What if it had ended differently? What if David spends the next 2 hours arguing with his brother? If he does, it doesn't end the way that we know it ends. And if he does, this story isn't the story that we know, because my guess is your Sunday school teacher wouldn't have taught you this story if David just stands there and argues with his brother. And the reason this is so important, where I think this lands for me, and my guess is it lands for some of you, is some of us are fighting with Eliab today. Some of us are fighting with Eliab today. And while you're busy fighting with Eliab, Goliath continues to go unchallenged in your life. While you continue to fight with Eliab, Goliath continues to go unchallenged in your life. And then David does this thing that's something I have to admit, this is something I'm learning to do. This is not something I do well. This is something that God is at work in my life to do, something I need to learn. And as I read and as I've been preparing for this series, I'm reminded of it over and over and over again. What I need to learn to do is what David did in this very moment. What I need to do, this is what I'm learning from David. I need to learn what to do in those moments where I realize I'm fighting against the wrong thing or fighting against the wrong person. Or when I'm trying to fight against something externally, when I really need to be focusing on a battle that I need to fight internally. Those moments where I realize that I need to stop fighting against what other people are or what they're doing, and I need to focus on the fight for self-control in my life that comes as a result of walking with God. And he does this really interesting thing. In verse 29, when you read it, David says something back to Eliab. He kind of gives him a verbal jab just to let him know, hey, I'm not a punk. But then he does something in verse 30, and what he does in verse 30 is more important than what he says in verse 29. Sometimes what we do is more important than what we say. And what he does in verse 30, this is what I need to learn. Check this out. He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. He turned and he asked somebody else. And here's the turning point of David's story, and it could be the turning point for your story. When David turns from Eliab, he's now positioned to face Goliath. When he turns from Eliab, he's now positioned to face Goliath. And some of us will never get to Goliath because we invest so much time and energy defending ourselves to Eliab. And we never get to our true enemy. We never face the one that we're truly called to defeat in our lives. And we end up warring and fighting against the very people, the very things that we're supposed to be fighting for. And see, this story, 2 alternate endings, right? You ask the question, what if, and you get 2 alternate endings. This story isn't the story you know if David trips over the ordinary. If David trips over the ordinary, this story is not the story that you know if he doesn't obey his father Jesse. And this story isn't the story you know if David trips over an offense. So you have ordinary and you have an offense. And if he trips over either of these 2 things, this story isn't the story that you know. And the reason that this is so important, and the reason we're doing an entire series on this story that you know so well, is because every story in this room is still being written. Every story in this room is still being written, and there are some of you who think you already know how your story ends, which is tragic. So again, I want to ask the question, what if? What if? What if it's not over yet? What if it's not over yet? What if your best days aren't behind you? What if your best days aren't behind you? What if everything that you've been to and through in your life could serve a greater purpose in your life? What if, and this is a wild thought, what if God is bringing you to your own valley of Elah? On purpose, for purpose. What if? What if? We're going to continue in David's story next week, but between now and then, my encouragement, my challenge, not just to you, but to myself more than anyone, is simply to focus on, who am I fighting against? In the midst of everything that I'm going through, am I focused on the right offense? Am I so wrapped up in trying to defend myself and come against people who are talking about me or defending myself to things that I've done or things that I'm not doing or whatever, all these expectations that people have in my life? Am I so busy and so invested in those battles that aren't the real battle that I've called to defeat? Or am I going to recalibrate and not allow myself to trip over offenses, but focus on the one that I've truly been called to defeat in my life and the things that I've truly been called to defeat in my life? And what about you? If you were to be honest with yourself, who are you at war with? Who are you fighting against? My challenge to you is not to fight against the things or the people that you're called to fight for, and to recalibrate and focus on the one true enemy that we all have. The war against ourselves and our selfish nature and our selfish desires, and then the one who comes, the enemy that comes to steal and to kill and destroy. David was able to turn his attention away from an enemy that he was trying to be triggered to fight, his own brother that he was supposed to be fighting for, and he shifted his focus and he recalibrated and then was positioned to fight the one he was called to defeat. And it led to him doing something that defined him as extraordinary. And so I wonder, what would happen if you and if I did that very same thing? And if we turned away from the people that we're warring against, that we're supposed to be fighting for, and all of us were focused on fighting the battle that we were truly called to fight. We're going to continue on in David's story next week, but as you live out your story today and this next week, I just want to pray for you that every single one of us would have the courage and the conviction to really evaluate where we are in our lives and what it is we're fighting against and what it is we're fighting for.